I think there are a number of ways I could answer this, so I'll just say whatever is in my heart right in this moment. A teachable thing for people to know that, no, I'm not better, and I don't know when I'm going to be.
Sheinelle Jones made millions of people believe that morning could begin safely. A calm voice, a smile that never slipped out of rhythm, a presence steady enough for viewers to entrust her with the most fragile moment of their day. But few knew that very steadiness was built from a life that always had to suppress itself. A life where emotions had no place and exhaustion was never allowed to show. She didn't enter television on a wave of glamour, but through discipline. No explosions, no controversy. Sheinelle learned how to survive inside a system where one missed beat means disappearance. Her talent was not in being remembered, but in never being permitted to be absent. Every morning on air was another time her body had to obey the clock. Every sentence delivered was another time her private life was pushed further behind. Behind a face that always looked fine were years worn down in silence, a punishing schedule, injuries that forced her to pay with her very voice, and personal losses that could not wait until the cameras turned off. Sheinelle's tragedy didn't erupt into scandal. It accumulated slowly. In each day, she was required to keep going, even as something inside her was cracking. This story is not about a star who collapses. It opens the journey of a woman who went too far down the road of being always steady. Yet when an entire life is built to be a support for others, who holds you when you begin to slip out of the rhythm of your own life? In the home where Sheinelle Jones grew up, words appeared more often than decorations. They were taped to walls, pinned to the refrigerator, placed in positions that could not be ignored, not as slogans meant to encourage, but as repeated instructions about choice, responsibility, and how a person should exist in their own life. Her mother, Sheila Kennard, was a teacher. She did not lecture about emotions, nor did she turn language into moral lessons. Evenings in the family often ended by rereading a passage, discussing the day's learning, or pausing over a current events question that had no immediate answer. Words did not stop at the wall. They entered daily life, into the way one listened and asked questions, until everyone understood more clearly, or at least understood why the question still needed to be asked. Sheinelle Marie Jones was born on April 19, 1978, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, into a family where order and expectations were not abstract concepts. Her father, C. Darnell Jones II, was a federal judge, a job tied to sustained pressure, constant scrutiny, and decisions that could not afford error. In that space, emotions were not denied, but they always had to come with self-control. Holding one's position mattered more than expressing one's state. Sheinelle's teenage years were tied to moving between school environments in Kansas, where she attended Wichita Brooks Middle Magnet School and later Wichita Heights High School. Changing schools happened as part of ordinary life, not dramatic enough to feel like a visible shock, but enough to require her, again and again, to adjust to a new classroom, new teachers, and the small social orders that were already in motion before she had even stepped in. That constant movement did not make Sheinelle feel lost in a theatrical way, but it created a prolonged condition, never fully belonging anywhere. Each new environment demanded quick adaptation, yet rarely offered safety long enough for her to settle. Sheinelle did not stand out by taking the center. She observed more than she spoke, listened more than she reacted. That composure helped her avoid disrupting the room, but it also made her presence easy to mistake for someone who was always fine, always ready, always someone who did not need to be checked on. Her personal needs, as a result, were gradually handled in silence. Sheinelle Jones did not enter television through a discovered moment, nor through a dramatic leap that would later be retold. The profession came to her first as a series of tasks that had to be done correctly, in spaces where lights were never allowed to create illusion. While still in high school in Wichita, Kansas, Sheinelle interned at KWCH-TV, a local CBS affiliate. There, television did not appear as a dream to chase, but as a strict operating system, a fixed broadcast schedule, scripts that had to be followed, airtime that could not be exceeded. The camera did not ask who you were. It only recorded whether you stood in the right place, at the right time, with the right voice. In Wichita, not every job inside the studio came with lights and laughter. There were afternoons when Sheinelle stood behind the teleprompter, counting lines in the script, listening to machines during test runs, and learning to adjust her reading speed to the director's countdown rhythm. There, she learned where to place her hands when looking into the lens, to check her earpiece before going live, and to accept that one stumbled sentence could force an entire newsroom to revise every word. Those early days did not feel like choice. They placed Sheinelle in one very specific position, learning how to remain inside the frame without disturbing the shared rhythm. She watched how editors adjusted each sentence, how anchors kept their tone steady even when the content changed at the last minute, how the entire newsroom moved like a single body when breaking news hit. No one spoke about passion. People spoke about accuracy. Sheinelle absorbed television in that same way, as a profession that demanded discipline before it allowed any emotion to appear. After graduating from Northwestern University in the early 2000s, where she participated in the Northwestern News Network and grew accustomed to being in front of a camera in a student setting that still operated by professional standards. Sheinelle began her first on-air job at Wix in Springfield, Illinois. It was a small market where an anchor often had to write the script, go into the field, then return to revise the wording right before airtime. There was no large team to distribute the load. A mistake, if it happened, had no cushion to hide behind. In Springfield, Sheinelle learned how to work through cold early shifts when the city had not yet woken. She learned how to keep her voice steady during broadcasts where viewers had no reason to be patient with error. There was no room to experiment with personality. Television here functioned like an essential service. It needed to show up consistently, reliably, without drawing attention to the person delivering it. Sheinelle did not stand out in a way that left an echo. She stood out in a harder-to-name way. She always completed her work without leaving a ripple. That steadiness brought her to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where she worked for Koki TV, the local Fox station. A larger market meant faster news rhythms, higher competitive pressure, and a more visible emphasis on appearance. Here, television did not only demand accuracy, it began to demand magnetism. But Sheinelle did not adjust herself to become more attention-grabbing. She kept the same calm delivery, never stealing the beat, never pushing emotion beyond what was necessary. In an environment where speed could easily lead to showmanship, she chose to keep the news from slipping out of her hands. Tulsa ended the way it operated, without leaving a single moment that needed to be remembered on its own, but long enough for professional habits to become reflex. It marked something else as well. Sheinelle had become used to television being both a workplace and a space of constant observation. She learned how to keep her presence from changing the structure of the room, while also not disappearing inside it. It was a difficult balance, sustained through restraint, the kind of quality people only recognize when it is gone. In 2005, Sheinelle returned to Philadelphia, this time not as a child who had grown up in the city, but as a professional entering WTXF-TV, a Fox station owned and operated by the network itself. This was a major newsroom where the broadcast rhythm began very early, rundowns were printed thick, and every last-minute change traveled straight from the director's earpiece into the anchor desk. Philadelphia was not a market where an anchor could ease into the audience. Every morning was treated like a live test. In WTXF-TV's morning studio, Sheinelle kept her vocal pitch almost unchanged from the beginning to the end of the newscast. When content moved quickly, traffic updates, weather, a live segment cutting in, she didn't speed up to chase it. Instead, she shortened her sentences, clarified the rhythm, so her delivery stayed aligned with the countdown clock on the monitor. There were broadcasts that ended with the final cue read cleanly, the lights cutting out on time, and the control room having no need to call the desk back for post-adjustments. Because the broadcast had closed itself inside its own timing frame. After shifts like that, the handoff was fast. The rundown was folded. The headset was set down. There was no list of loose ends to recheck. In the newsroom schedule, Sheinelle's name was often written in the simplest way possible, a time slot that could run without requiring backup. Some mornings, feedback arrived not through ratings, but through the newsroom phone. A short call from an older viewer asking again for an address that had been read too quickly. An email pointing out that a street name had not been pronounced in the local accent. Those notes were printed and clipped to the end of the rundown, not to be debated, but to be corrected in the very next broadcast. In 2014, after nearly a decade in Philadelphia, Sheinelle moved into NBC News and became part of Weekend Today. It was a shift from local television to a national network, not loud, but placing her inside a denser field of attention. Here, every detail came with preset standards: the camera, the program rhythm, the way a face is positioned in America's morning. For Sheinelle, what changed was not the scale of broadcast, but the density of scrutiny. Mistakes were smaller, but their life was longer. In local television, an error could pass within the boundaries of a single market. In national television, an error stays. It is remembered, dissected, and attached to a brand. Sheinelle entered that space with a very clear choice: not to try to stand out. She carried the style already formed: restraint, composure, never disturbing the shared rhythm, and placed it inside a tighter structure, with less tolerance. Weekend Today unfolded on weekend mornings, when the house was only halfway awake, and words needed to be just enough to keep the day from starting in a broken rhythm. There, each sentence had to hold tightly to its moment, and then return the space so the morning could continue. Sheinelle stepped into that hour like someone accustomed to listening to the clock before listening to herself. She did not need to make her voice more television. She did not need to adjust her image to draw attention. Her presence was steady enough to keep the program from slipping off beat, yet light enough not to take the space for herself. On weekend mornings, when the show shifted from news into conversation, Sheinelle often let the guest finish a full sentence before responding. Some exchanges were not cut early, not rushed into the next segment. When she was absent, the program still ran, but at times it needed an extra reminder beat, a guiding glance, a short pause to allow everything to find its position again. It was precisely during this period that her workload quietly thickened without needing any announcement. One extra day, one extra hour, and then it became the new weekly habit. She was not only co-anchor of Weekend Today, but also took on the role of co-host on the third hour of Today when that hour launched, appearing on air 6 days a week. On paper, it was trust. In reality, it was the consequence of Sheinelle being too suitable to keep unchanged, and therefore continuing to be given more. Sheinelle did not take on additional roles because she wanted to climb higher. She took them because nothing about her suggested she couldn't do it. In a system driven by repetition, the person whose work requires the least fixing is usually the first name called. No one asked whether that was sustainable. No one raised the question of limits. The fact that you could do it became reason enough for you to keep having to do it. And from that point, the question no longer revolved around accepting or refusing. It shifted into something else, harder to name. When your name is already fixed in the schedule, when the familiar morning rhythm is built around your presence, the space for personal choice begins to shrink. Slowing down, even by a beat, however small, is enough to expose a gap that the entire program has to see. In that situation, stepping back is no longer a private act. It has to be explained. And Sheinelle, from her earliest days standing behind the teleprompter to the moment she sat at the anchor desk, had always been the kind of person who handled things differently, staying so the rhythm would not break. In 2020, that operating rhythm was forced to slow down, not because of a professional decision, but because the body spoke. Sheinelle had to undergo surgery to address damage to her vocal cords. In morning television, this wasn't merely a medical issue. The voice is the central tool of the job, the thing that allows a person to appear every day without needing explanation. When the voice falters, the entire logic of continuous presence is immediately suspended. After surgery, Sheinelle had to remain completely silent for 2 weeks. No talking, no whispering, no rehearsing. For someone whose profession is built on speech, that silence did not mean rest. It was a compulsory void, a period in which the familiar tool suddenly fell outside the range of use. The 6 weeks off air that followed extended that condition beyond the personal realm, placing it directly into the broadcast schedule. Before that point, in the days leading up to the surgery, Sheinelle continued to show up on time, completing the morning routines she knew by heart, then leaving the studio earlier than usual. There was no long explanation, no story placed on air. The usual motions, checking equipment, preparing her position, tracking the program's rhythm, still happened in full until they were forced to pause. While Sheinelle was absent, the program did not panic. There was no public disruption, no gap officially named. The anchor desk still lit up every morning. The time slots kept running. Other faces stepped in, held the rhythm, continued the familiar flow. Television, like all large structures, does not stop to wait for an individual to recover. The crucial point was this: Sheinelle did not take the morning with her. There was no major adjustment, no structural change. The system shifted only slightly, just enough to keep functioning. For viewers, mornings still passed as usual. For the show, the shared rhythm stayed intact, and that very smoothness made the absence harder to name than any visible crisis. When Sheinelle returned after 6 weeks, the surface of everything seemed unchanged. The same lights, the same desk. The program rhythm still running along its old trajectory, but the experience of enforced silence left a different marker behind. For the first time, the central tool of the profession was no longer something she could assume would always be there. And for the first time, continuous presence, once treated as identity, revealed itself as the result of prolonged endurance rather than a natural state. Sheinelle did not turn that experience into drama. She did not speak much about it on air. She did not transform it into personal confession. Like many things in the way she worked, it was noted and then set down in its proper place so the rhythm of work could continue. But from that moment on, a new reality had quietly entered. The body had spoken once, and television, built on stability, had learned how to operate even when that voice was temporarily absent. In the years that followed, Sheinelle continued in her role as co-host of the third hour of Today, alongside her familiar presence across the program ecosystem. That hour required a very specific kind of balance, solid enough for current events, soft enough for daily life. Sheinelle fit not because of rapid shifts in persona, but because she maintained a single steady condition throughout. so the content segments wouldn't pull against one another. Here, trust came not only from saying things correctly, but from keeping the program from feeling patched together. Sheinelle became an invisible anchor within that structure. She didn't need to take the center of a conversation to control it. Her mere presence kept the overall rhythm at a predictable level. It was something audiences sensed before they could name it, and also the reason her absence, however rare, was always felt with clarity. In 2021, Sheinelle expanded her work beyond the frame when she served as executive producer for the documentary Stories We Tell: The Fertility Secret. This was not an on-camera role, and it didn't place her as the central host or storyteller. The project positioned Sheinelle behind the scenes, where decisions about structure, narrative rhythm, and the order of a story's unfolding matter as much as the content being spoken. The film focused on fertility experiences that are often ignored in mainstream media. Sheinelle did not appear to explain or conclude. She contributed by ensuring the question could be held in full, allowing the subjects to complete their own stories without being shortened by airtime restrictions or the familiar cutting rhythm of morning television. The role did not create a Sheinelle moment, but it created conditions in which other voices would not slip out of frame. Her involvement was not introduced as a career turning point. There was no announcement of a new direction. Sheinelle still appeared steadily on air, still held the program's rhythm every day, as if the project were simply another extension of the same professional logic that had existed all along. A logic that prioritizes structure, endurance, and letting the content stand on its own without requiring the host to validate its meaning. As American television entered a period of turbulence, shifts in personnel, schedules, and viewing habits, Sheinelle's presence continued to be seen as part of continuity. Not surprising, not exhausting. A kind of presence that required constant internal adjustment, yet rarely revealed the effort behind it. Whatever movements occurred happened quietly enough not to throw the system off beat, and clearly enough for those close to recognize that this structure was being held by more than what appeared on air. By the end of 2025, NBC Today announced an adjustment to the program's structure. Sheinelle would leave the 9 a.m. hour and become a permanent co-host of the 4th hour, beginning in January 2026. On the surface, it was not a promotion, nor was it a step backward. It was a reallocation, placing Sheinelle into a different space within the same system where the program rhythm allowed longer dialogue and was less dominated by the pressure of breaking news. Leaving the 3rd hour of Today, officially on January 2, 2026, closed a long stretch in which Sheinelle had operated on a 6-days-a-week rhythm. There was no loud farewell, no summary framed as a milestone. The transition happened exactly as she had moved through her career, quietly, with structure, and without demanding excessive explanation. In the 4th hour, alongside Jenna Bush Hager, Sheinelle stepped into a different kind of rhythm. This program allowed more room for personal stories, for sharing, for moments that did not need an immediate conclusion. Here, trust was not built only by holding the pace, but by allowing breathing space to exist as a legitimate part of the structure. The key point is this: Sheinelle did not leave the morning. She left a particular type of morning, one in which every beat required absolute control, where presence had to be precise down to the minute, and where emotion was always placed behind structure. Compared with the 3rd hour, the 4th hour did not require the host to constantly anchor the flow of information. It allowed softness without sacrificing stability. For Sheinelle, this shift did not resemble a branding strategy. She did not reposition her image. She did not attempt to reinvent herself through a dramatically different role. She simply moved into a space where the rhythm she had maintained for many years was no longer the default demand. The stability remained, but it no longer had to be held through the highest level of control. Sheinelle did not step away from morning television because it became difficult. She adjusted her position within it, after understanding the cost of staying too long inside a structure that allowed only one mode of existence. This was not a move to go further. It was a move to continue, at a pace her body and her life could endure. The change unfolded quietly. No grand announcement, no closing statement summarizing the old chapter. Only a shift, just enough not to cause disruption, yet different enough to open a new kind of living space inside the same morning. The path Sheinelle has taken did not produce sharp breaking points. It was formed through small adjustments, repeated long enough to become a familiar way of existing. Each step forward did not require her to abandon the old structure, but simply to shift her position inside it, from a small market to a larger system, from one role to another, under the same unspoken requirement. The rhythm must be held, no matter what is happening outside the frame. The limits arrived very late, after the work rhythm had already become the body's reflex. They appeared through a prolonged schedule, through the body being forced to speak, through silent adjustments made so she could continue to appear without throwing the system off beat. In that process, Sheinelle learned with absolute clarity how a person can last inside a structure, by shrinking herself just enough at the right time and leaving no trace of the tension behind it. When a professional rhythm has operated long enough to become reflex, Sheinelle's life begins to split into two spaces that do not need to intersect. One space runs on schedules, airtime, and presence kept on beat. The other forms earlier, more quietly, and does not submit to measurement by any public structure. In that space, presence is not confirmed by appearing, but by staying. Sheinelle Jones met Uche Oj when they were both students at Northwestern University, at a stage of life not yet cut apart by the boundary between private and public. Their relationship did not grow from a beginning that would later be remembered, but from the repeated closeness of ordinary days, where two people were simply there together, without needing to name what was happening. They stayed beside each other for many years before marrying in 2007. That marriage did not arrive with a story that demanded retelling, nor was it built as a representative image. It grew out of very specific, quiet choices, staying when leaving was possible, arranging life in order to continue, and accepting a shared rhythm as something to be maintained rather than declared. Uche did not enter Sheinelle's life as a companion to the lights. He existed behind them, in a private space where fame had no operational role, and where a relationship is held together by endurance rather than visibility. Inside their home, closeness did not live in marked moments, but in repetition so constant they became the base layer of life. Someone always remembered to lock the back door after everyone had gone upstairs. Someone always checked one small thing before turning off the lights. Some evenings, the kitchen was cleaned in the same exact order, as if that order made the next day less chaotic. When something needed to be discussed, they did not turn it into a long conversation. They said enough to understand each other, then returned to the life already running. Peaceful days lasted that way. No need to prove anything, no need to retell it, only the need to be in the right place at the right time. Their 3 children entered the family not like milestones being marked, but like gradual adjustments in rhythm. Mornings started earlier. Evenings ended later. The household schedule was broken into smaller units: school hours, sleep hours, drop-offs and pickups, and tasks that could not be moved to another day. Decisions that once could be revisited now had to be made quickly, not because there was no thought, but because there was no longer time for extended consideration. In that rhythm, emotion did not have much space to spread into story. It was handled on the spot, through repeated habits, preparing meals in the same sequence, checking backpacks before bedtime, keeping needed items ready in their familiar places. The family ran on doing more than speaking. What happened inside did not need to be carried outside for confirmation or proof, because it was already real enough within its own boundaries. Years passed like that, without a disruption large enough to force everyone to stop and look at the entire picture. There was no clear moment to name as a turning point. Family life existed as a steady current, where closeness did not need emphasis because it had already seeped into the day-night rhythm, into the way the members were there for each other without needing to say it aloud. In 2023, Uche's illness appeared. Treatment began. Trips and familiar routines gradually yielded to medical appointments. Time was broken into smaller pieces, measured by each visit. Days grew longer, not because there was more to do, but because everything else had withdrawn from the family's life. As the illness progressed, decisions changed as well. Hospice care entered the home quietly. Daily rhythm adjusted to new principles. Quieter, slower, centered on what had to be done within the day. Not many words were kept. Most time passed in presence, close enough not to miss anything, quiet enough not to create additional pressure. The final months began with Sheinelle staying home. Outside schedules disappeared. The living space turned around a single room, fixed visiting hours, medical equipment placed neatly against the wall. The lights always kept at just enough brightness so no one would startle awake in the middle of the night. Night in the house was no longer the end of a day, but a long, quiet watch. Sometimes the sound of footsteps moved softly down the hallway and stopped at the door, a new habit of listening. Sometimes, Sheinelle stood still for a few seconds to distinguish what was the sound of the machine, what was breathing, what was simply the house creaking as the temperature shifted. Everything was arranged neatly, but nothing felt truly neat inside. A chair pulled a little closer, a towel set ready in the right spot. A glass of water always within reach. Those things did not create a story. They only created the conditions not to miss anything. Sheinelle was there most of the time. Morning began with small tasks repeated every day. Checking water, medication, room temperature. There were long stretches of simply sitting still. When needed, she adjusted a pillow. When not needed, she stayed there anyway. Words grew sparse. In that room, presence became the only way to keep everything from slipping out of one's hands. The days passed without milestones. There were no plans for next week, no story of what was coming. Each day was handled as if it were the only unit of time left. Sheinelle did not leave that room unless necessary. Bringing water, adjusting pillows, staying. Those actions repeated themselves until there was no longer any need for repetition. There were days that ended without anyone calling them the last day. Evening passed like every other evening. Lights turned off early, doors closed softly. Familiar tasks done more slowly in order not to miss anything. In that room, there was no sign that a boundary was approaching. Only the feeling that movement had narrowed to the point where there was no space left for leaving. Uche passed away on May 23, 2025. There was no prepared moment to close the chapter. No clear border between before and after. The departure happened inside the family's space, where the people who remained did not need confirmation that it had happened. They simply began living in a house missing a familiar presence. The days after did not take the shape of a prolonged funeral or a visible collapse. The schedule continued. The children still had to wake up on time. Meals still had to be prepared. There were tasks that could not be delayed just because someone was no longer there. But in the spaces between those necessary actions, life began to slow down in harder-to-notice ways. Mornings that stretched longer than usual. Evenings where no one said the line that ends the day. Sheinelle did not enter complete silence. She still spoke when necessary, still answered questions, but her answers grew shorter. Pauses appeared more often. There were moments when she stopped in the middle of a familiar action, as if she needed extra time to remember what the next step was, even though everything had once run on pure momentum. Within the family space, absence did not arrive as a shock. It spread slowly, a chair no longer pulled out, an evening habit no longer performed by anyone. Small details repeating every day, enough to remind them that something had changed permanently, even if no one said it out loud. The three children carried the loss in different ways. Some questions were asked and then left hanging. Some days, no one mentioned their father. Some days, his name surfaced very softly, inside an unfinished sentence. Sheinelle was there, not to explain, but to keep the space from breaking open. She continued the necessary tasks, as if maintaining structure were the only way the next day could still begin. Sheinelle did not withdraw completely, nor did she try to reassure others. It showed itself in quiet erosion, in having to decide things that once required no thought, in carrying the missing part of another person into every new day. There was no marked moment of facing it, only a long sequence of days where simply existing became an action performed step by step. Things that once needed no thinking now became choices she had to place on the table herself. A phone call she had to make alone. A small decision she had to sign alone. A question from a child arriving at an unprepared moment, and an answer that could not be long, but also could not be empty. Some days Sheinelle would see a familiar object sitting in its old place and realize she had unconsciously slowed down, as if the body were still waiting for an old reflex to occur. Some evenings she stood in the kitchen a few minutes after everything was finished, doing nothing more, simply letting the day end with a rhythm quiet enough to keep the house from breaking. Space began to be used differently. Some rooms were entered less often. Some familiar places became empty in a way that did not need to be filled. Daylight was left as it was. Evening arrived earlier. Lights were kept at just enough brightness. Silence was not the goal, but the baseline condition. Small tasks still repeated, simple meals prepared, cleaning done at a slower pace. Some things once done by two people were now done by one, but the method did not change. Not to hold on, not out of nostalgia, only because there was not yet a reason to do it differently. Familiar movements kept the day from fracturing. Sheinelle spent time with the children in a way that did not require planning, not to fill a void, simply to remain in the same space long enough. Sometimes there was a lot of talking. Sometimes there were no words at all. No one needed to prove whether things were okay or not. Each person kept their own rhythm. Sometimes Sheinelle left the house, walked a short distance, sat in a familiar place, and returned. No purpose was assigned to those departures. They happened as a way for the body to keep moving when the mind did not yet need to decide anything. Work returned, but not in a dominating way. It entered the day as something familiar, not needing emphasis. Time was divided just enough, not packed, not hollow. Breaks were not something to justify. Time was not measured by milestones. There was no phase given a name. No question of whether she was ready or not. Each day was handled as it arrived, not required to represent anything larger than itself. Sheinelle did not turn what was happening into a story that needed to be told. There was no need to explain, no need to assign meaning to loss. What remained was kept within private space, where presence does not need to be seen to have value. Everything continued, not in the old way and not in a clearly defined new shape, only continued, day by day, through actions small enough not to add more weight. What Sheinelle leaves behind is rarely recognized while it is happening. It only becomes visible when she is not there on a certain morning, when the program rhythm still runs, but something of the familiar steadiness is missing. Not because something is wrong, but because a support that had existed long enough to become the base layer is no longer there. For many years, Sheinelle did not shape the space through personality, but through not throwing it off. A question was allowed to be asked in full. An answer was not forced to rush. A conversation had room to pause before being pulled too far. Those things did not create single memorable moments, but they created a long sequence of days that did not need to be repaired. Sheinelle's influence does not lie in the direction she drove content toward, but in the way she allowed content to exist without depending on the host. When she was there, structure stood on its own. When she stepped back, structure did not collapse. But people began to realize there had once been a kind of presence that made everything lighter without needing to be named. In mornings that required constant talking, Sheinelle formed a habit that ran against the common tempo. She asked a question, then stopped long enough for the other person to complete their own sentence. Not by slowing the conversation down, but by refusing to push it faster than necessary. That habit did not create an instantly memorable moment. It simply stayed, until the room became accustomed to the fact that a small open space was always being held in the right place. Sheinelle's story does not close with a declaration. It stops there, in the pause, just long enough after a question, where no one rushes to cut in, and the morning rhythm continues without needing a louder voice or stronger emphasis. If you have ever felt safe as a morning began to move smoothly, if you have ever sensed that the quiet presence of one person could hold an entire structure steady, then perhaps you have touched what Sheinelle leaves behind, without naming it, without closing it, simply there, quietly, like a rhythm strong enough for others to keep moving alongside.